I guess I think everyone knows Danielle Smith. There's no one that we would sooner. The only way we could be happier with this is if you were actually here in the room with us, Danielle. But hopefully next year you'll be in the room with us. So thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Would please welcome. Can we have a warm round of applause for Alberta's most famous, recently retired talk show host? So here.
Well, thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you, Danielle. Can you hear Can you hear the applause, Danielle?
Oh, that's very kind.
Can you hear?
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you for that. Now,
thanks for joining us. You're on. Okay, go ahead.
You got it. So I've got a bit of a strange setup here because I have some slides to show you. This is also my work gear. So when I told you that I was going to be able to still be at a job where I couldn't get fired, I wasn't kidding. So I was at the restaurant this morning serving tables. Eggs Benedict is our most popular item in case you do end up finding your way down to the Whistle Stop Diner. And no, we're not that Whistle Stop, the one in Mirror that had the courage to stay open and challenge the government laws. They push things along for all of us. So I want to thank them, but I don't want to take credit where credit is not due. So I want to start off today by just maybe answering a few questions about the issue of how we raise taxes, because when Paul told me that you had no one to present why Alberta should collect its own taxes, I was astonished, because that to me is such an obvious one to do for so many reasons. There's an issue of being able to build capacity. There's also an issue of efficiency. There's an issue of simplicity. And for those of you who think that Alberta should go its own way, I know that that's been a theme that has gone through this discussion. How do you go your own way if you're still expecting Ottawa to collect your taxes and send a portion to you? So I think the case can be made, even within Confederation. I think it could be made even if we have a more sovereignty association type of relationship with Canada, if that's what we move to. And it certainly could be made that you absolutely have to do it if you're going to have any serious threat that if we don't get the things that we want, then we're out of here. So I just on those bases alone, I think I should have convinced you. But I know that there are some who still think that this is going to be inefficient or ineffective or not necessary or what have you. So I have a number of slides that I want to go through, because it occurs to me there's a few questions that people always ask me. One is, well, why don't we just withhold our money from Ottawa? Why don't we just not send those taxes in? And the other is, well, why don't we just send our taxes to Alberta instead? And it got me thinking that maybe people don't realize how taxes are collected in the first place. And so I thought I should go through that a bit. And I know it's not the same way for everyone, but for the vast majority of us, if you've got withholding tax that comes off your check, then someone else is collecting that for you. And that is what I want to go through right now, because you want to see a tax collector? I'm a tax collector, and I'll show you the ways in which I collect taxes. Now, the reason I want to go through this is because it struck me when I was speaking with Premier Jason Kenney on my last show, that one of the things he said is businesses don't, because I asked him about the issue of tax collection and whether that would be a referendum question in the fall, along with an equalization referendum question. He sounds like he's studying Alberta pension plan, and he's studying the provincial police force, which means, you know how these guys work, they can study forever. But he flat out said no on the issue of collecting our own taxes. And the reason he said so was, well, businesses don't want to fill out another piece of paper. So I didn't challenge him on that. But when a politician says that, it's like they're talking from the 1960s, when we all used to take a piece of the paper and the pencil, and we used to fill it out manually, and then we used to have to cut a check and send it in. And so I would like to tell you that something got invented in the meantime. The internet got invented in the meantime, and software got invented in the meantime. And so it makes my job as a tax collector a whole lot easier than it ever used to be. So I want to dismantle that argument right now, that it's just adding one more headache to business owners, because I must tell you, it would be zero additional headache for me. And I'm a small guy, right? So I just use software to do all of this for me. So I want to show you I'll show you how I do my payroll, and you can see how I collect taxes for the government. So here is the first screen. when I go on to do my payroll every week, I get this screen that comes up. Payworks, for those of you who don't have Payworks, let me just give a little plug for it. I'm a member of CFIB, and this is the simplest and cheapest way to do your payroll taxes, because otherwise it would be a darn headache, and I'll show you why. So this is what would pop up telling me how many days I have left until I do my payroll. This is Marlena Smith. You may have heard of her. She's keyed in here as a dishwasher, although her husband sometimes lets her serve tables. But this gives you an idea of how the program sets up all of the different ways in which you have to collect taxes. It puts in your tax credits, talks about whether you've got exempt. It gives you tax overrides. So for that particular client, particular worker, you can put in different taxes. It has what province you're in, your WCB number. You can see you collect CPP. There's federal tax, provincial tax, and so on and so forth. EI is in there as well. So this is all programmed into this computer that I use. And then I go through and I load up the hours of all of my different workers. And then bingo bango, I press a button to generate payroll. And then bang, it tells me how much I need to transfer over to the bank. Payroll, they tell me to transfer this amount. This to process this many was $7, so it's not hugely overwhelming. And then you'll see down here on a regular basis, they submit a chunk of money to the federal government, and they submit a chunk of money to the provincial government for my workers' comp. Now, why am I showing you all this? It would be if we collected our own personal income taxes, it would just be a change in the computer programming. Me as the tax collector, it wouldn't do anything different for me. I would press a button, it would all be done in behind the scenes, and then the Payworks department would just would forward the money so that it could be so that it could end up in the right place. And this is the other interesting thing I want to show you as well, is this is how the payroll ends up appearing. You know what's so interesting about this? It's got a line here for federal tax, a line here for CPP, a line for EI. So where's the provincial tax? I think what is left, when you have it all amalgamated like this, no one has any idea how much they're paying in federal taxes versus provincial taxes. I think sort of intuitively we know Ottawa collects it all and then they kick a portion back. But this is the way in which it is masked how much we give to the federal government versus the provincial government. It's just simply not clear. I hope this point raises to you that the idea that this is going to be administratively too complex for business owners to possibly manage, no. Here's the other way I collect taxes. So this is my screen. You can come into the Whistle Stop. You can have Southwest Cheeseburger. It's one of our favorites. You can have draft beer. We support our local beer. So we've got High River Brewing Company on tap. It's a pale ale. And we also have Hubtown Brewing Company in Okotoks on tap. They've got a beautiful Irish red. Your bill comes to separates it out, food and alcohol. And then look at here at the bottom, GST. So there you are. Every single day, every single bill, I am collecting GST for the government. It shows you how it appears when I take it over to the table. And would it be really complicated? Now, I'm not advocating that we have another sales tax. I do know that there are business groups out there, and I do know that there is the potential that if there was ever a referendum, we could decide to collect our own provincial taxes. Would it be difficult as a business owner to add that on? No, because the computer program does that for me too. I have the tax number right now, it's just the GST. And then here's another tax number that I could just zip on there and it would go through and it would collect it for me. And at the end of the day, when I'm doing my accounting at home, it shows me exactly how much money I picked up in GST for the day on the day's sales. So I think politicians who say that this is administratively complicated are politicians who've never run a business and never used software. This is not administratively complicated. It's just an excuse because they don't want to do it. So what would be the reasons why they don't want to do it? Let me get into the issue of simplicity, because I think that's the issue. Part of what we've done at the federal level when we integrate with our federal taxes is it allows for them to overcharge us. And then we have to kind of beg for our money back at the end of the year, right? So it's not about, it's funny when I have people say, well, let's just not file our taxes. Well, if you're in the situation where your withholding tax has already been taken off of you and you choose not to file your taxes, so you don't claim your RSP credit and your charitable tax credit and your daycare and all of the other ways that you can get write-offs, you're telling them they can keep more money from you than you're entitled to get back. So showing that you're going to take a tax stand by failing to file your tax return just hurts you. It doesn't hurt them. So I don't know how many of you have filed your own tax returns. I do. I use TurboTax. Again, the software makes this super simple. So you go through, and this is the interesting part, because I just pulled up a new screen for this year and just typed in $100,000, just assuming that a person made $100,000 with no deductions at all. And guess what happens? It populates automatically all of these different screens. This is what you pay for your net federal taxes if you had $100,000. But what's interesting is, look at this. You've got 3 pages of provincial taxes that are underneath, and it has all of the different categories, because Rachel Notley made it a lot more complex when she came in. We've got a bunch of different deductions. We've got a higher basic personal exemption. We've got a second page of non-refundable tax credits. We've got a third page that calculates your Alberta tax. What's the point I'm making here? This exists already. This is proprietary, independent software. If we collected our own personal income taxes, we would have these same forms that would populate in the same way. The only thing that would be different is when you got to another screen at the end and it showed you how much you owed, you would send an e-transfer to the federal government and an e-transfer to the provincial government. So is that going to be something that is so administratively overwhelming that we can't possibly do it? You can see from my sarcastic tone that I think the answer is no. Now, here's the other aspect of it, is if you're worried, well, we're just going to have to hire a whole bunch of new bureaucrats. Well, look at this screen. Alberta, making payments to the Tax and Revenue Administration. We already collect our own taxes on a whole range of other types of taxes. What do we collect? We have a carbon levy, a corporate income tax, emergency 911 levy, a fuel tax, a health cost recovery, insurance premium tax, international fuel tax agreement, tobacco tax, tourism levy, not to mention all the money that comes in through a whole separate way of tax collection with the royalty payments. This is the issue, is that I think that there's some notion, maybe it goes back to the Robin Hood movies, of a magistrate going around to each community and somebody coming with their chickens and their hens and delivering a certain portion of what they owe to the sheriff of Nottingham. That's not how it works these days. There aren't tax collectors. The tax collectors are the businesses who collect it on your behalf, and it's you as well when you do your self-reporting and then you cut the check at the end of the year. So we already have an army of bureaucrats who are doing this in Alberta for all of these different types of taxes. Would it be that much more administratively complicated to take over our personal income taxes? I tell you, the answer is no. Now, the other aspect that we hear about why we want to continue having our taxes fall under the federal agency is because the role that the government does play is, if we decide not to play along and we don't cut them a check and we don't pay them, that's when they start charging interest and penalties. And that's when they send out the auditors to make sure that you're paying the appropriate amount and that they're getting their money. Now, isn't this an interesting story, though? Canada Revenue Agency falling behind on uncollected taxes. It's risen now. This was 44 billion. The story from the CBC was a couple of years ago. They estimated by now they'd be up to 47 billion in uncollected taxes. Who knows what's going to happen after CERB? I suspect we're going to see several tens of billions of dollars that also remain uncollected once this is all over as well. So the amount of tax that Canadians admit to owing Ottawa but haven't paid totaled a record of $43.8 billion a year, despite a Liberal government promise to stabilize that amount. If you look at the other thing I've circled there, the rise in tax debt level over the last decade or so appears to be linked to major staff reductions at CRA under the former Conservative government's deficit cutting program. It's not a CBC article unless they're slamming the former Conservative government for something, isn't it? The next one says, but that effort hasn't stopped the total from growing by 5.6% in 2017-18 alone, so faster than inflation and the economy itself. There's more that I wanted to show you on this one. Undisputed amounts. The agency currently does not collect about $8.40 for every $100 that's due. So you guys do, for those of you who are business owners and you do your accounts receivable, You do your own math on that. What would happen to your business if you had outstanding amounts not owned of a significant nature, and then you couldn't collect 8.5% of that? That seems like a pretty high rate of non-collection, if you ask me, because we collect every day. I don't have any outstanding amounts in my business. And if I had that kind of outstanding amount, my business wouldn't operate. It says the agency says its success in rooting out some underground activity and tax avoidance has contributed in part to the growth in the tax debt. We'll talk about tax avoidance because I think that's the really important part of why we need a simpler system. And then this last one, it coincides directly with dramatic cuts to staff and office closures. So if you're going to argue to me that you don't want Alberta to collect its own taxes because you don't want to hire any more bureaucrats, they're going to be hired at the federal level anyway. And they're going to be hired to be fully bilingual because that's one of the requirements, which means they're all going to be hired from Quebec. So why wouldn't we, if we're thinking of hiring people onto the payroll for a government, why wouldn't we rather have them here than have them in Ottawa? I'll just put that to you. Even still, I don't know that that's necessarily the truth, because unions will always make an argument for why they have to increase their number of people. As I've shown you, there's so many fixes that you can have with software. It does strike me that perhaps they just need to find some efficiencies. So let's talk about tax avoidance. Oh, our favorite, World Economic Forum. This may explain a little bit why they're getting so concerned about why we need to switch to fully electronic currency and get rid of actual dollar bills. It's this issue of tax avoidance. Which countries are worst affected by tax avoidance? I'm sure you guys have talked about World Economic Forum. That's Klaus Schwab's vehicle to try to coordinate all the rich elites of the world to make sure that in the shift to stakeholder capitalism away from shareholder capitalism. And so this is one of the things that they're quite concerned about, is which countries are worst affected by tax avoidance. And if you look at this graph, what you'll see is that overall losses have increased. So from 1980 until now, the number of the tax losses that they call them, this is money that the government would otherwise collect but is being avoided, has increased over the past 30 years. And the higher income the OECD country is, the higher the amount of dollars that is being avoided. So what is going on there? Let's talk about the Laffer curve for a minute, because I just loved this concept when I was in taking my economics program. And I've made reference to it a lot, but I thought, well, this is a perfect time for us to talk about it. What does the Laffer curve tell us? It's this notion that there's an optimal tax rate, that if you tax your society at a 0% rate, you're going to collect zero in revenues. That's what this is what that means. If you tax your society at 100%, that you expect to take every single dollar, then you're going to get zero, because you will have so stifled work effort, no one is going to work, and you're not going to get any money either. Or they'll find ways to avoid, they'll move it offshore. So somewhere along this increase in taxes that you're doing, you're going to be able to maximize the amount of revenue that you get. And then there's some sweet spot, whatever that is, I don't think we know. And then it becomes prohibitive. When the tax rates get too high, that's when you start going down the other way. You can't just increase taxes forever and expect that you're going to increase revenues forever. That's the big mistake that the left always makes. And then, because once you start taxing it beyond about 50%, that's when it starts decreasing. That's something to keep in mind every time you hear the left talk about, all we need to do is just impose a wealth tax on the super rich, anyone making over or anyone who has more than $20 million in assets. Let's just levy a wealth tax on top of that. Well, they haven't read the Laffer curve, and they don't understand that that would just mean that all those guys would set up their offshore accounts in Panama, and nobody would be getting any of those dollars. And then when they realized it didn't work, guess what would happen then? Well, then we have to start taxing homes, and we have to start taxing our farmers and ranchers who have large tracts of land, ostensibly just sitting there waiting to be taxed. So this is the real danger of this kind of conversation, is that they really don't understand that there are people who have the means to move their money. And if you make taxes prohibitive, you'll end up increasing your tax avoidance. I think that's what that last chart showed. So perhaps we need to move away from talking about tax rates and talk about tax simplicity. Because if you have to hire an army of tax lawyers and tax accountants, no offense to you guys, I use an accountant myself for my business tax, for my corporate return. But if you make it so complex, then you've got a huge number of transaction costs. But if you're going to hire a lawyer or an accountant, you're going to be as aggressive as possible in reducing your overall tax load. So what is the benefit of simpler taxes? Simpler taxes have lower compliance costs in both time and money, and may encourage taxpayers to use tax provisions aimed at helping people pay for socially desirable activities. I mean, if it was simpler for you to just do your tax return yourself, cut a check and send it in, then not only do we reduce the transaction costs for lawyers and for accountants, but you end up with more tax dollars available for government programs. So when I was in at the Calgary Herald years ago, one of the things that I did as a series was the Hall and Rabushka model for a flat tax. Now, flat tax is really interesting because their whole notion behind it is you have a single rate that you charge to both your individuals and your businesses. And there's good reason to do that. The reason you do that, and I think this is where the premier may have screwed up, the reason you do that is because you don't want to create a lower rate for businesses, because then you would have individuals who would incorporate as businesses and not pay the same, so that they could avoid paying the higher individual rate. So they have a good model for what you do is you charge the same rate, businesses and corporate, but you create a postcard-sized tax return. So it's not multiple pages and multiple annexes. This is the individual one that they've done. This is done in an American context with the American federal government with in mind for how they would simplify it. But this is for an individual wage earner. You've got your wages, and then you've got some simple deductions based on whether you are living with a couple or with kids, and a couple of other little things. Tax rate on this example was 19%. We wouldn't be that high, of course. We'd probably be able to settle out at 8%, both corporate and individual. And then you send it in. And then this is the postcard tax return for the other side, for the corporate side. Also very simplified. So that would be the other reason why you would want to go down the path of creating your own tax form, is so that you can do this kind of simplification. And in doing the simplification, this is my great dream, that if Alberta takes the lead in demonstrating that we could have a simplified tax return, and it ends up showing more compliance, less tax avoidance, then we could have some influence on our provincial neighbors doing the same thing. And who knows, I know that this is really living in Technicolor, but why not? Maybe ultimately you could convince the federal government to go down the same track as well. So there's to me, it's a no-brainer. We already have the capacity to collect our taxes because we do on a whole range of fronts. We can simplify if we were to separate from the federal government and collect our own taxes. We would create the transparency. So then you would know exactly how many of your dollars go to support your provincial programs and exactly how many of your dollars go to support federal programs and don't come back here, because that's the constant fight that we end up having. In addition to that, we would have control over our own audit function. I don't know how many of you have run afoul of the auditors, but I have, in the roles that I've been in over the years, the nastiness that we have of our federal auditors in dealing with business owners and individuals. We could create an entirely different culture in how we do the audit function. And I guess most importantly for those of you who are thinking that Alberta doesn't have a future in Canada, I still hold out hope that they do. But for those of you who don't, you can't be an independent nation if you can't control your own taxes. You can't keep on asking Ottawa to do this function on your behalf. And the other thing too is I just don't know what level of leverage having the federal government collect our taxes for us. I don't know what kind of leverage that gives to them over our decision making, because we know that the federal government has imposed itself with its federal spending power across a whole range of provincial programs. And if we were to collect our own taxes, ideally, the next step beyond that would be, you know what, federal government, we've got this efficient program, we'll collect yours too. And we'll just hive off the amount you'd normally transfer us, and we'll send you the rest. for the things that are your area of responsibility. We could change the federal fiscal relationship that we have with between the provincial and federal government, but we can't have any of those conversations unless we're prepared to take the first step. So maybe I haven't yet convinced you. It's just so obvious to me that this is the absolute first step that we need to take. And so I suppose, I know I'm supposed to end because I saw John Robson chastise us all that we were supposed to have a very simplified question that we would put forward on the ballot. But I think if I was to just write it on the fly, it would be that Alberta should collect all its own taxes, or Alberta should collect its own provincial income taxes, something along those lines. And if someone can massage that to a better question, I'm all ears. So with that in mind, I think that's all I have to say. If there's any questions anyone has for me, I'm more than happy to answer them, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Danielle. Could you hear the warm applause?
Yeah.
If you can hear the applause, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Very good. Well, there was lots of applause, and thank you for joining us. And you're next up, but we'll do to you what you always do to us when we call in. Say, well, thanks for calling in, but now we have to have a message from our sponsor, so just stand by it. So I can just say that when Pat and I are traveling in southern Alberta, we always stop at the Whistle Stop Cafe in High River. And last time we were there, we were treated to lovely food, and the young lady who was waiting on us treated us like family. So I strongly recommend.
You're welcome. And this isn't just virtue signaling. I want everyone to know.
Now we're back to our show, Danielle. You don't have to put your mask on. We're all here.
I just want to say we follow the rules, don't we?
Anybody have a question for Danielle? Here we are. Donna Lee's coming to the mic so you can see him. Thanks.
Hi, Michelle. I agree with you 100%. We have to collect our own taxes if we're going to have any sort of self-determination. But I want to ask you about that you mentioned, had a whole bunch of slides there about tax avoidance. And I'm not 100% sure what you were meaning, because tax avoidance is completely legal. Right? When we contribute money to RSPs, we are able to avoid tax, at least a portion of tax. That's what tax avoidance is. But then when you put up those charts, it looked like what you were really talking about was tax evasion, which is against the law. So I wonder if you could just clarify for all of us and for me, were you really talking about legal methods to reduce our tax, which is tax avoidance, or were you talking about illegal tax evasion?
I think what this slide shows a couple of things is that people will acknowledge that they owe money to CRA, but then they don't pay it. So in just sort of the very simplest graph, the one that they are able to calculate, they know $44 billion is owed to them. It has been self-assessed, but people are avoiding paying it. So that would be one way. The other is that you have legal means to move your money offshore. It's perfectly legal for all of these companies to set up these various trusts and move their money down to these tax havens. So that's perfectly legal too. They're avoiding paying the taxes in the Canadian jurisdiction because we've created such a complex system for them. And so if you can make it easier for people to pay taxes here, then maybe they won't go through that rigmarole of avoiding it and chasing after the lowest tax jurisdiction. And then thirdly, if you can simplify your tax system, like, look, I would far rather have a tax system that says you are going to get X amount of dollars for you, X amount of dollars for your wife, X amount of dollars for each of your kids, and get rid of all of the other, make them generous, and just get rid of all of the other micro ways in which government tries to manipulate our behavior by buying bus passes or doing green investments in home renovation or sports programs and art programs for your kids. Like, just allow for very basic deductions for individual, spouse, and kids, and have a single rate of tax after that. And then you have a simple system so people aren't having to chase around after all of those different deductions. So to me, the simpler you make it, the more compliance you're going to get, the easier it's going to be for people to make sure that they're paying the appropriate amount of tax, but also get the appropriate amount of write-offs. So I look at it as threefold. So those are the ways in which I put it in the realm of avoidance. Evasion, of course, is done when you don't declare your income, and that's part of the underground economy. And so this is the other question. If you've got a simple, fair tax system, are you going to have more people willing to come into the legal economy and pay all of the rates that they're supposed to be paying? If you make it onerous, then you're going to find that they are going to stay in the underground economy. So I think that there are lots of things that we could do potentially to get rid of that black market as well as make it easier for us to collect more of the taxes and keep more of the businesses and individuals centered here so that they can support our programs.
Next question. Benita?
Hi, Danielle. My name's Benita Peterson. I'm from Westlock, Alberta. I love your ideas. I absolutely love them. I have a question for you with regards to persuading Albertans to this way of thinking, especially senior citizens who have been traditionally paying Canada Revenue Agency in Winnipeg for the last 50 or 60 years. So for those seniors who are just accustomed to that, that's their tradition, that's what they've been doing, to change that mindset to say, you're not sending money to Winnipeg anymore, you're sending it to the province of Alberta. How do we effectively persuade them to do so?
Look, you don't need to get 100%. That's all I'd say, right? I mean, there are lots of people who are of the view that, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And I guess I think our relationship with Ottawa is fundamentally broken. So my starting point is, what are the ways in which we can fix it? And this is, to me, it's just that once you become a grown-up province, you do grown-up things. And grown-up provinces collect their own darn taxes. They take care of their own police. And they provide for their citizens through the pension plan. There's probably a whole battery of other things that you guys have come up with that they should do as well. It just strikes me that there will be some people who don't feel that way, that are perfectly happy with Alberta's role in Canada, perfectly happy with the relationship. Taxes are really complex. Lots of people have somebody else file it for them. They don't understand who collects them, how they're collected. And they'll be persuaded by the argument that this is just way too much work and way too complicated. So we just have to focus on, I think, those who do understand. There's lots of us who are business owners, lots of us who filed our own taxes, who know that this would not be a difficult thing to do. And to me, the biggest argument is on the issue. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm alone in knowing some of the horror stories of how the CRA auditors have treated some people who have been under audit. But I think that we could have a lighter, more gentle touch in our auditing function. And I think that we would end up with more compliance and so more dollars coming in. And we can make it simpler. That would be the things that I would think would be the selling features. Is it should be super simple to do. Anyone should be able to go online and fill out their own tax return, and you shouldn't have to hire H&R Block to do it for you. You shouldn't have to hire an accountant to do it for you. It should be that simple that you should be able to do it yourself. And also the idea that we want to make sure that it's easy enough for people to do their taxes here so that we can attract more people, so that we can pay for more programs for seniors.
Might I say, are you more programs for seniors? Are you thinking of running again? Is there anything that you'd like to announce right here on freedomtalk.ca?
No, my husband, Danny, you've talked to my husband. He's a hard no on running for office.
We'll stop by for lunch. Mark Milkey, who's spoken at our conference several times and who I quite respect, but I don't always agree with, had an article in the paper the other day called Fiscal Fantasies About Collecting Your Own Tax. And he said, well, what Albertans don't realize is you'd have to hire 5,000 people if you wanted to collect your own tax. And I thought, yeah, Mark, like we all know that. And we would fire 10,000 people in Ottawa that are doing it right now for us, and we're paying for it. You know what I mean? And
right.
Then, thank you very much. And then the 5,000 people that we had hired would be living in our communities, eating at the Whistle Stop Cafe, going to our arenas, going to our libraries, going to our schools. So I mean, yeah, there would be some changes, but it would, as Maxime mentioned this last night in his thing. You radically decentralize. Let the activity be in your own community. Let it be in your own province. So do we have any other questions? I'm sure. Yeah, Rick, come on up.
What?
Rick.
Can I make another
You might
comment on
recognize
that?
this person. We call him Rick. Some
Beautiful.
people call him like, what is it? Ex-convict or jailbird? I guess now you're a pardoned convict. Yeah. Come on, Rick.
So Danny, if I can make a comment on that, on what you just said though, because anyone who says that it's far more efficient for a central authority to be collecting taxes and it would be outrageous to do anything else, then why does our provincial government make municipalities collect their education portion of the property tax? There's 365 municipalities, and they all have to collect, I think it's only about $2.4 billion. And so you've got 365 independent municipal tax agencies collecting the property taxes and then remitting half of it to the provincial government. So that seems to be the exact counter case. And nobody's making the counter case that Alberta, for efficiencies purposes, they should be the central tax collector for all the municipalities, and then they should divvy out the money to each of the municipalities. So if we've accepted that municipalities should have control over their own financial life, or at least the big bulk of it, why wouldn't we take that same approach with our own provincial government?
That's an excellent point, and you're getting a good round of applause if you can hear it. So thank you very much. Rick, go ahead.
Well, hi there, Smitty. It's good to see you. I have a better face for radio than television, so I'm kind of hesitant to do that. But to elaborate a little bit on what you've just said there, I've traveled to Texas a couple of times now, quite enjoy it, and they actually have no state tax. Each county gets to like you're talking about municipalities, each county gets to have its own tax. And that then decentralizes that tax grab. Many people don't know this, but the GDP of Texas is equivalent to the GDP of this country. It's and they done that by decentralizing that tax thing. So if these municipalities are already taking taxes, as you're saying, so do you think that might be? I mean, that's a whole other step towards independent thinking, local decentralized thinking. But what's your thoughts there, please?
It's such a great comment, Rick, and thanks. Nice. It's nice to see you. It's been a little while. But here's what I think we need to do. There's something dysfunctional. Maybe this goes without saying. Something really dysfunctional about the way that government collects and disperses taxes. So we have just look at the municipal level of government, because I made a comment about that. I looked at it once a couple of years ago. So the municipal level of government collects a certain portion of taxes, sends half of it to Edmonton, or the provincial capital, and then it gets divvied around a bunch of different departments, and then they end up sending back through various grants about the same amount of money that we've just in Calgary sent up to them, and that calculation is similar. It's not perfect, but across the majority of municipalities, if you took a look at that, I bet you would see the amount of money that a municipality transfers to Edmonton is about the same amount of transfers that they get back in all of these different capital programs. Why wouldn't you take the approach then of saying, let's just end this silly tax and transfer game? You don't need to send us the education portion of the property taxes. We'll fund education out of our other revenues, and you can just keep all of what you create locally and what you generate locally, and we won't transfer you any money anymore. And the reason why politicians don't like to do this is because municipal governments like to be able to leverage their various grants from different levels of government to pay for local infrastructure. That would be one reason. The other reason is provincial governments want to take credit. Every time a new community arena is announced, or an irrigation expansion, or a road widening, they want to be there to cut the ribbon. But really, should we be structuring our tax system just so that we can get good photo ops for politicians? I don't happen to think so. So that would be one thing I would say. And that same thinking then applies at the federal level. The federal government should only take as much money as they need to fund their areas of jurisdiction. Areas of jurisdiction are involved in international trade, military, international foreign aid, immigration, although we could talk about whether we should have our own immigration program. I think like Quebec, I think there's some value in us doing that as well. And then they should leave to the provinces the ability to collect with their own source revenue, their own needs. We shouldn't be sending money to Ottawa and then having them transfer it back to us for healthcare and social services and infrastructure and all of the other things. But it's the same game that gets played. The game that gets played is that provinces like to leverage their different capital projects by getting matching grants. And then the federal government likes to be able to do the announcements, just like they did a couple of weeks ago with Don Iveson, proudly saying that the federal government had come in with new money for LRT that isn't going to start flowing to them until 2026. So you're going to have to not just re-elect Justin Trudeau, you're going to have to re-elect him twice before any of that money flows. But they all get the photo ops for it. And to me, that's created a massive dysfunctionality in the way our federation works. Each level of government should be responsible with its own source revenue to pay for the things in its own community. And then if there are needs that are identified where there's shortfalls, then you can create focus programs to help with that. But the system that we have right now, all it benefits is the bureaucrats who are shuffling the money around between different departments and making life and death decisions over projects in various communities or various provinces. And at the federal level, it's even twice as dysfunctional because we know that we do not get an equal or fair portion of those dollars coming back because the federal bureaucrats and the federal government have decided, especially the Liberals, that they cannot win seats in Western Canada. So it makes far more sense to do those kind of matching programs in Ontario and Quebec and Atlantic Canada and maybe even British Columbia where they can get the votes. And so why would we allow our dollars to be used against us this way? That's another reason why we should be working on keeping as much here so that the system becomes transparent. We're able to say, we don't need your dollars. And by the way, here's the check we're cutting to you every year that we know is not coming back here. We know that this is the slush fund that you're using to win votes elsewhere. And that's when we can start getting some political pressure to try to change the system as a whole. But you can't start any of that unless you create the transparency and people know exactly how much money is going where, so that you can track these dollars and so that you can create the political pressure.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. I think you'll recognize our next question giver. We were singing happy birthday to him this morning. You'll see him in a minute.
Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Todd.
Jack Mintz, who's one of the leading authorities on taxation, not just in Canada but in the world, believes that the collection of taxes in Alberta is the most important part of the Alberta agenda. If you connect it to transfer of tax points, as happens for some programs in Quebec, transfer of tax points rather than transfer of money from the federal government would allow Alberta then to shape its taxation to make it more business friendly and more suitable for economic development. So I wouldn't be too concerned about Mark Milkey. I remember when Stephen Harper and I and several others first published the Alberta Agenda in 1990, Mark jumped in then with criticism on this point of Alberta collecting its own taxes. It seems that he hasn't changed his opinion in 20 years, but I think on this topic, Jack Mintz is actually the authority, and maybe you could get him to come and explain sometime much more than I can what could be accomplished by a combination of collecting our own income tax and linking that to transfer of tax points and giving Alberta then more ability to shape the tax system in an economic friendly direction.
Awesome point. If you look at how much, and it may have changed in the last couple of years, but there was, and Quebec has grown quite a bit. They're doing quite well. But there was a point when I looked at the stats, maybe from 2014, where the total amount of money that the federal government collected from various means from Alberta was $50 billion. And then there was, and I think that particular year, something like $24 billion that was transferred back. So what Dr. Tom is talking about is ending that transfer. So instead of sending 50 billion and getting 24 back, we would transfer the tax points and we'd keep that 24 billion here. And all we would send them would be $26 billion. And I like the idea of that, because then we don't have all of the bureaucrats in the mix who are shuffling the money back and forth. But then it creates that transparency that, yes, Alberta, you really are sending 26 billion or 20 billion or 15 billion or whatever it happens to be in a given year as your price to be in Confederation that does not come back to you at all. I think that that's the kind of transparency that we need, but also keeping the own source revenues here locally. I'd love to hear what Professor Mintz would have to say about the ways in which that could create some greater efficiencies here. I think that's maybe a good topic for next year, Danny.
Certainly, we'll put the topic on the agenda, and we'll put you as a speaker, and we'll look forward to it. So we'll confirm the date.
No, Professor Mintz, I think you need to get in. He's the master.
Yeah, exactly. Fair enough.
I'm just a lowly tax collector.
Well, you're a pretty friendly one, I must say. At least for the 5 weeks. Does anybody else have a question? Or I think we've taken quite a bit of your time. Well, seeing none, Danielle, thank you very much for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you at our next conference in person. Okay.
You bet. Thanks, guys. We'll see you.
Thank you.